There are artists who change the way we see. There are artists who change the way we think. And then, very rarely, once or twice in the entire history of civilization, there is an artist who changes what we believe is possible for a human being to do. Michelangelo Buonarroti was that third kind. He painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling alone, lying on his back, for 4 years. In a building he didn't want to be in, on a commission he tried to refuse, in a medium he insisted was not his own. He carved the David from a block of marble that 2 other sculptors had already abandoned as unworkable. He designed the dome of St. Peter's Basilica at the age of 72 and kept working on it until he died at 88. He was born into a minor noble family that considered art beneath their station, and he spent his entire life arguing with popes, surviving political revolutions, outliving everyone he loved, and producing work of a scale and quality that has never been equaled. He was difficult. He was obsessive. He was paranoid about his money, indifferent to his physical comfort, and constitutionally incapable of walking away from a problem that everyone else had declared unsolvable. He was also, by every account of everyone who spent serious time with him, the most extraordinary human being they had ever encountered. This is not the story of a saint. The church made him a saint of a kind after his death, and the textbooks have been completing that canonization ever since. This is the story of a man, furious, tender, profoundly lonely, spiritually tormented, and possessed of a physical and intellectual endurance that defied every reasonable limit his body and his century tried to impose on him. This is Art and Ashes. Stay with me. This one goes deep, and it's worth every minute. Before we begin, subscribe if you're new here. Leave a comment telling us where you're listening from and what brought you to a story about Michelangelo at this hour. Every comment gets read, every one. To understand Michelangelo, you have to start not with Florence, and not with the Sistine Chapel, but with a small farming village in the Tuscan hills, and a family that had one consuming ambition: to be taken seriously. Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti. Simone was born on March 6, 1475, in the town of Caprese, where his father Lodovico was serving a brief term as the local magistrate. The family returned to Florence shortly after his birth, and it was in Florence, the most intellectually combustible city in Europe, that Michelangelo would spend the years that formed everything he became. The Buonarroti family occupied an uncomfortable middle position in Florentine society. They had a name, and in Florence, a name with the prefix Buonarroti carried the implication of old money and civic respectability. But the money had thinned over generations, and by the time Lodovico was raising his children, the family's claim to gentility was more historical memory than present reality. Lodovico was proud of the family name in the way that people are proud of things they didn't earn, and are terrified of losing, and the thing that frightened him most, more than poverty, more than obscurity, was the idea that a son of his might become an artisan. Painters and sculptors in 15th century Florence were not gentlemen. They were skilled workers, respected, sometimes celebrated, occasionally wealthy, but workers nonetheless. They worked with their hands. They got marble dust in their lungs and paint under their fingernails. They took commissions and fulfilled specifications set by patrons who were, socially, their superiors. For a Buonarroti, this was considered a form of degradation. Michelangelo later claimed that his father beat him for drawing. Lodovico disputed this. What is not disputed is that the household's attitude toward the boy's obsession with art was hostile, contemptuous, and entirely unable to stop it. Because Michelangelo could not stop. The compulsion was there from the beginning, not as a talent that could be encouraged or discouraged, but as something closer to a biological drive. He drew on whatever surface was available. He spent more time looking at the paintings in Florence's churches than he spent in school. He had friends who were artists' apprentices, and he learned more in their company than from any teacher his father could provide. The friend who mattered most was a boy named Francesco Granacci, a few years older than Michelangelo, who was already apprenticed to the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of the most successful painters in Florence. It was Granacci who introduced Michelangelo to the workshop. It was Granacci who showed him what was possible, and it was through Granacci's persistent advocacy that Lodovico Buonarroti was eventually persuaded, against every instinct he had, to allow his 13-year-old son to become an apprentice. Lodovico signed the contract with Ghirlandaio in 1488. He negotiated a wage for his son, an unusual arrangement since apprentices typically paid for their training rather than receiving payment. The fact that Ghirlandaio agreed to pay suggests he had already seen enough of the boy's work to know that the normal terms did not apply. Michelangelo spent less than a year in Ghirlandaio's workshop before something happened that redirected the entire course of his life. Lorenzo de' Medici noticed him. Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, was the most powerful man in Florence, the de facto ruler of the Republic, the primary patron of the arts in the most artistically ambitious city in Europe, and a man whose eye for talent was, by the testimony of everyone around him, almost supernatural in its accuracy. Lorenzo had established a kind of informal school for young sculptors in the gardens of the monastery of San Marco, adjacent to the Medici Palace. The sculptor Bertoldo di Giovanni, a student of Donatello and the keeper of Lorenzo's collection of ancient bronzes, supervised the students. But it was Lorenzo himself who moved among them, watching, questioning, identifying who among them had something beyond mere skill. Michelangelo was transferred to the garden school. How exactly this happened is not entirely clear from the sources. And within months, Lorenzo had made a decision that was, by the standards of the era, almost without precedent. He invited the boy to live in the Medici Palace. Not as a servant, not as a junior workshop assistant, as a member of the household, as someone whose company Lorenzo valued, whose development he intended to oversee personally, and who would eat at the Medici table, alongside philosophers, poets, humanists, and the most formidable intellectual minds in Europe. Michelangelo was 14 years old, the son of a minor official who had beaten him for drawing, and now he was sitting at dinner with Poliziano, with Ficino, with Pico della Mirandola, the men whose ideas about the dignity of the human being, the relationship between beauty and the divine, and the possibility of a unified human knowledge, were reshaping the intellectual foundations of the Western world. He absorbed it all, not passively. Michelangelo was never passive about anything, but with the ferocious, somewhat combative attention that would characterize his relationship to ideas for the rest of his life. And he carved. The works he produced during his years in Lorenzo's household are still astonishing to stand in front of. the Battle of the Centaurs, a churning mass of intertwined male bodies in combat, carved in marble when he was approximately 17, has a muscular energy and compositional complexity that Michelangelo's contemporaries, who were mostly twice his age, found difficult to look at without some mixture of admiration and unease. Where did this come from? How did a 17-year-old boy, barely 2 years into any formal training, produce something that looked like the mature work of a master? The question has no completely satisfying answer. The Medici garden gave him access to the finest collection of ancient sculpture in Italy, Greek and Roman works that showed him what the human body was capable of becoming in stone. The dinner table gave him a philosophical framework for understanding why the human body mattered, why representing it with absolute fidelity and absolute beauty was not decoration, but theology. But the hands were his own. The eye was his own. The obsessive, almost violent relationship with the marble. That was entirely, irreducibly his own. In April of 1492, Lorenzo de' Medici died. He was 43 years old. He had been ill for some time. Gout, primarily, the Medici family curse. And his death was not entirely unexpected, but its effect on Florence, and on Michelangelo specifically, was seismic. Lorenzo had been the gravitational center of everything that made Florence what it was. His son Piero, known to history as Piero the Unfortunate, which tells you most of what you need to know, lacked his father's intelligence, his political instincts, and his ability to hold together the fragile coalition of interests on which Medici power rested. Within 2 years, Florence would be convulsed by the preaching of the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, a man of terrifying moral intensity who declared the Medici court a cesspool of pagan excess and called for the destruction of art, books, mirrors, and anything else that might distract a Christian soul from God. The bonfire of the vanities, in which Florentines actually carried their paintings, their musical instruments, their cosmetics, and their books into the public square and burned them, was not a metaphor. It happened. In 1497, in the city that had produced Leonardo, Botticelli, and Michelangelo, some of Botticelli's own paintings were among the things that burned. Michelangelo left Florence before the worst of it. He went to Bologna, then to Rome, sensing, correctly, that the future of his career lay not in a city tearing itself apart over the soul of the Renaissance, but in the city where the most powerful patron in the world was always looking for the greatest artist alive. Rome, the Pope, and a commission that would produce the most heartbreaking work Michelangelo ever made. He was 21 years old when he arrived in Rome for the first time. The city he found was not the imperial capital of ancient memory, that Rome had been rubble for 1,000 years. This was a city in the early stages of rebuilding itself into the capital of Christendom, with all the ambition, corruption, violence, and splendor that implied. A French cardinal named Jean de Billère de la Grolas commissioned a marble sculpture. The subject, the Virgin Mary holding the body of the dead Christ after the crucifixion. The traditional subject for this composition, known as the Pietà, had a long history in Northern European art. In Italian art, it was less common. What the cardinal received was something nobody in any tradition had produced before. Michelangelo finished the Pietà in 1499. He was 24 years old. The work is, by almost any standard of assessment, the most technically perfect sculpture ever carved. Not the most powerful. Michelangelo would surpass it in power later. Not the most ambitious. He would surpass it in ambition many times. But in terms of what marble can be made to do, in the fineness of the surface, in the rendering of cloth, of flesh, of the precise transition between living skin and the cold stillness of death, nothing has ever equaled it. The Virgin is young, too young. Contemporary observers notice this immediately and ask Michelangelo about it. His answer has been repeated and interpreted so many times that it has taken on the quality of legend. He said that women who remain pure do not age as other women do, that the Virgin's youth was a theological statement, not an error. This may be true. It is also possible that Michelangelo, 24 years old, carving a mother holding her dead son, had his own mother in his mind, Francesca di Neri, who died when he was 6 years old, before he was old enough to have a clear memory of her face, and whose absence left a wound in him that no biographer has ever quite measured, because Michelangelo himself never spoke about it directly. There is one more thing about the Pietà that matters. It is the only work Michelangelo ever signed. After the sculpture was installed and began attracting crowds, Michelangelo overheard visitors attributing it to another sculptor. He returned at night, alone, and carved his name across the sash on the Virgin's chest. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florent facibat. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florentine, made this. He later said he regretted it, that it was an act of pride he was ashamed of, that a Christian artist should not seek credit for what God had moved his hands to make. He never signed another work. He returned to Florence in 1501 to face what was, by any description, an impossible task. The cathedral workshop, the Opera del Duomo, possessed a massive block of Carrara marble. That had been sitting in their yard for 26 years. The block had originally been quarried and partially roughed out for a commission that was never completed. 2 other sculptors had worked on it and abandoned it. One had drilled a hole in it in a place that made certain poses structurally impossible. The marble had been exposed to the weather for decades. Everyone agreed it was probably too damaged to use. Michelangelo asked to see it. What followed is one of the most examined creative processes in the history of art. Michelangelo spent weeks studying the block, its dimensions, its grain, the location of the damage, the flaws in the stone. He made dozens of small wax models, testing different poses, different orientations of the figure within the block. He was looking for the sculpture that was already inside the marble. The phrase attributed to him, that the sculptor's job is simply to remove what isn't needed, captures something genuinely true about how he worked. He was not imposing his vision on the stone. He was listening to it. The David was unveiled in 1504, after approximately 2.5 years of work. It is 17 feet tall. It weighs over 12,000 pounds, and it depicts a moment that no previous artist had chosen to represent. Not David triumphant, holding the severed head of Goliath. Not David in battle. Not the victory. The moment before. David has seen Goliath. He has assessed the situation. He has made the decision. He is not yet moved. He stands with the sling over his shoulder and the stone in his right hand, and his face carries an expression that Michelangelo scholars have been describing for 5 centuries without ever fully agreeing on what it is. Concentration, calculation, fear perhaps, not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that sharpens. The face of a person who has decided to do something that cannot be undone and is taking one last full breath before doing it. The David was meant to stand on the roof of the cathedral. When it was finished, a committee of the most important artists in Florence, including Leonardo da Vinci, convened to decide where it should actually go. They concluded it was too important, too powerful, to be placed anywhere that made it difficult to see. It was installed in the Piazza della Signoria, the central public square of Florence, as the symbol of the Republic. A 17-foot man carved from a damaged block of marble that everyone had given up on, standing in the center of a city that was being asked to believe in itself. The symbolism was not accidental. He was 30 years old. He had already produced the Pietà and the David. By any reasonable assessment of a career, he had already done enough. The Pope had other ideas. Julius II, Giuliano della Rovere, elected Pope in 1503, was not a man who thought in small terms. He was rebuilding Rome as the capital of a renewed Christendom. He was tearing down the old St. Peter's Basilica, which had stood for 1,200 years, to build a new one. He was engaged in military campaigns to reconquer the Papal States. He was, by temperament and by conviction, a man who wanted to leave the world permanently altered by the fact of his existence. He and Michelangelo were, in this respect, the same person. Their relationship was one of the most productive and most explosive in the history of art patronage. They fought constantly, loudly, bitterly, sometimes publicly. Michelangelo abandoned Rome at one point, when Julius refused to receive him, and Julius sent messengers after him, demanding he return. Michelangelo refused. The Pope threatened to go to Florence himself and drag him back. The artist eventually returned, because Julius had offered him something that no reasonable person could refuse, and that Michelangelo, despite being a reasonable person in almost no other respect, could not refuse either. He had offered him the tomb of Julius II, a monument of such ambition and scale that it would have stood as the greatest sculptural project since ancient Rome. 40 figures, bronze reliefs, a freestanding structure as large as a chapel. For a sculptor, it was everything. And then Julius changed his mind. He wanted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel painted instead. Michelangelo's response, documented in letters and recorded by contemporaries, was direct. He was a sculptor, not a painter. He had not been trained in fresco. The ceiling was a job for a painter. He would not do it. Julius insisted. There is a theory, supported by circumstantial evidence and argued by several serious historians, that the commission was engineered by Michelangelo's rivals, particularly the architect Bramante, as a deliberate trap. The idea being that if Michelangelo failed publicly, if a sculptor given a painter's job produced something mediocre in the most visible building in Christendom, his reputation would be destroyed, and the field would be clear for Raphael, who was younger, more charming, easier to work with, and who was already painting the papal apartments in the room next door. If this was the plan, it was among the most catastrophically miscalculated acts of professional sabotage in the history of human competition. Michelangelo began work on the Sistine ceiling in 1508. He was 33 years old. He dismissed the assistants he had initially hired, experienced fresco painters from Florence, because their work was not good enough. He taught himself fresco technique as he went, learning the medium on what was, by any measure, the most demanding possible canvas. He worked on scaffolding of his own design, not lying flat as the legend has it, but standing with his head thrown back, his neck at an angle that gave him chronic pain for the rest of his life. He painted in that position, with plaster dripping into his eyes and beard, for 4 years. He wrote a poem about it, a comic sonnet, addressed to a friend, describing the physical indignities of the work in terms that are simultaneously self-deprecating and quietly horrifying. He describes his belly thrust forward, his spine bent like a bow, his brush dripping onto his face. He says his painting is dead, that he is not a painter. And then he went back to work. The Sistine Chapel ceiling covers approximately 5,800 square feet. It contains over 300 individual figures. It is organized into 9 central narrative panels depicting scenes from Genesis, from the separation of light from darkness to the drunkenness of Noah, surrounded by figures of prophets and sibyls, ancestors of Christ, and ignudi, nude male figures whose function is partly decorative and partly theological, and partly, it seems, an expression of Michelangelo's conviction that the male body in its ideal form was the most complete visible expression of the divine. At the center of the ceiling, in the 4th of the 9 panels, is the image that has become the most reproduced religious image in the history of Western art: the creation of Adam. God, depicted not as a remote abstraction, but as an old man of enormous physical power, wrapped in a billowing cloak, surrounded by angels, reaches across the empty space of the universe toward the figure of Adam, who reclines on a rocky promontory, with an arm extended in response, his finger, almost, but not quite, touching God's. The gap between the fingers is the most analyzed space in the history of art. It has been interpreted as the moment of the transmission of life, as the distance between the human and the divine, as the space where consciousness exists, neither fully in the body nor fully in God, but in the charged air between them. Neurologists have noted that the shape formed by God's cloak and the figures within it is anatomically identical to a cross-section of the human brain, and have argued that Michelangelo, who had dissected human skulls, encoded this deliberately, that in this image, God is not simply creating Adam. God is the mind. Michelangelo never confirmed or denied this interpretation. He never confirmed or denied most interpretations of his work. He believed that if the work needed explaining, it had failed. The ceiling was unveiled in October of 1512. Julius II, who had commissioned it, who had fought with Michelangelo throughout its creation, who had at one point struck the artist with his staff for failing to deliver on schedule, died 5 months later, without seeing it in its completed state. The response to the ceiling was immediate and overwhelming. Even Raphael, the man whose success Michelangelo privately resented and whose talent he privately respected, came to see it, and was reported to have said that he was grateful he had been born in the same age as Michelangelo. Bramante, who may have engineered the commission as a trap, said nothing recorded. The decades that followed were among the most turbulent of Michelangelo's long life. He was caught in the collapse of the Medici government in Florence, changed political allegiances under pressure, was briefly on the wrong side of a siege of the city, and survived the aftermath through a combination of his fame, his usefulness to the new order, and what appears to have been a genuinely extraordinary capacity to endure situations that would have destroyed other men. He spent years working on the tomb of Julius II, the project that had been promised to him before the Sistine ceiling interrupted everything, and watched it shrink, commission by commission, negotiation by negotiation, from the monument of 40 figures that Julius had originally described to the relatively modest wall tomb that was eventually installed in San Pietro in Vincoli in 1545. The Moses he carved for that tomb is one of the works for which he is best remembered today. An old man of terrifying authority, seated, with the tablets of the law under one arm, and a beard of such extraordinary detail that Sigmund Freud spent 3 weeks in front of it in 1913, and then wrote an entire essay trying to determine what emotion the figure was suppressing. Freud's conclusion was that Moses was suppressing rage, that he had seen the Israelites worshiping the golden calf and was in the process of deciding whether to shatter the tablets. Whether or not Freud was right about Moses, he was certainly right about Michelangelo. There is a part of Michelangelo's story that the grand narrative of ceilings and papal commissions tends to leave in the margins, not because the information is difficult to find. It is documented in letters, poems, and contemporary accounts, but because it asks us to hold a more complete and more vulnerable version of the man than the myth usually permits. Michelangelo loved a young Roman nobleman named Tommaso de Cavalieri with an intensity that he himself found overwhelming. He was 57 years old when they met in 1532. Cavalieri was approximately 23. He was, by all accounts, extraordinarily beautiful, cultivated, and possessed of a genuine interest in art and ideas that went beyond the social performance of appreciation. Michelangelo sent him letters. He sent him drawings, elaborate, beautiful presentation drawings of mythological subjects that were among the most refined things he ever made on paper. And he sent him poems, sonnets of an emotional directness that left no ambiguity about the nature of what he felt. He wrote, "If the love I feel for you could be captured in a single look, then every difficulty in life would disappear." He wrote, "I know well that it must appear to you, a wise and prudent man, that I am greatly and foolishly carried away, since to this excess of desire I dedicate myself with such fervor, and because I believe that it befits a man to have just one single soul, so did I dedicate mine entirely to you." What exactly these letters meant, what exactly the relationship between Michelangelo and Cavalieri was, is a question scholars have argued about for decades. The vocabulary of intense male friendship in the Renaissance occupied territory that the modern world has divided into categories the Renaissance itself didn't recognize. But the emotional reality of what Michelangelo felt, the completeness of it, the surrender of it, the way it consumed him for years, is not in dispute. Cavalieri remained close to Michelangelo for the rest of the artist's life. He was at his bedside when he died. Whatever the precise nature of the relationship, it was the most sustained and most complete human connection Michelangelo ever permitted himself. In 1534, Michelangelo left Florence for the last time and settled permanently in Rome. He was 59 years old. He would live another 30 years. The work those 30 years produced is staggering in its ambition and its darkness. Pope Paul III commissioned him to paint the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. the wall that faces the ceiling he had painted a quarter century before. The subject, the Last Judgment. Michelangelo spent 5 years on it. He was 66 when it was unveiled in 1541, and what he painted was not the serene, hierarchical image of divine justice that the tradition and the papacy expected. It was a vision of terrifying turbulence, 400 figures in motion, ascending, descending, dragged down, lifted up, in a composition with no stable center and no easy reassurance. Christ at the center is not the gentle shepherd of earlier tradition. He is young and powerful, and his arm is raised, not in blessing, but in a gesture of absolute finality. Michelangelo painted himself into the fresco. He is in the skin held by Saint Bartholomew. Bartholomew was martyred by being flayed alive, a limp, deflated human skin, dangling from the saint's hand, the face on it recognizably Michelangelo's own. A man who has been emptied, a man who has been stripped of everything. It is one of the most desolating self-portraits in the history of art. The Last Judgment scandalized Rome. The nudity of the figures was described by a papal master of ceremonies as more appropriate to a bathhouse than a chapel. The Pope's response to this complaint became one of the more satisfying anecdotes of the period. He said that if the man had been sent to purgatory, he could have interceded for him. But since he had been sent to hell, there was nothing to be done. After Michelangelo died, another artist was commissioned to paint loincloths over the most conspicuously naked figures. The artist who accepted this commission was known thereafter, throughout Rome, as the breeches maker. The last great work of Michelangelo's life was not a painting, not a sculpture. It was a building. In 1546, at the age of 71, he accepted the commission to be the chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica. The project had been ongoing for decades. Multiple architects had worked on it. The plans had been changed, revised, argued about, and partially built in ways that Michelangelo, upon examining them, declared fundamentally flawed. He took the commission on one condition: he would accept no payment. He worked on it as an act of devotion, for the glory of God and for the soul of St. Peter. No other reason. He redesigned the entire project. He simplified where previous architects had complicated. He unified where they had fragmented. And he designed the dome, the enormous ribbed dome that still defines the skyline of Rome, with a clarity and structural logic that his successor, Giacomo della Porta, modified slightly when he completed it in 1590, 26 years after Michelangelo's death, but did not fundamentally change. Every day, for the last 18 years of his life, Michelangelo went to the site, in his 70s, in his 80s, through Roman winters and Roman summers. In the last years, he could no longer walk the distance and traveled by horse or by carriage, but he went. He understood, with the clarity of a man who has lived long enough to see the patterns of his own life, that he would not see it finished. He was building something for a world that would exist after him, and he went to the site every day anyway, because the alternative, stopping, resting, waiting for the end, was not something he knew how to do. In his final decade, Michelangelo returned obsessively to the subject. That had defined his relationship to marble from the beginning. The Pietà, the body of a dead man held by those who loved him. He carved 3 of them in his last years, each more stripped down than the last, each less interested in technical perfection and more interested in something harder to name, the raw emotional fact of grief, of holding, of the specific weight of a body that no longer has life in it. The Florentine Pietà, also called the Deposition, was intended by Michelangelo for his own tomb. He worked on it for over a decade, and then, one night in 1555, he took a hammer to it. The reasons are not entirely clear. He may have discovered a flaw in the marble. He may have been dissatisfied with certain passages of the carving. He may have been in one of the dark periods that descended on him with increasing frequency. In his final years, periods of profound depression in which he destroyed his own work because nothing he made seemed adequate to what he had imagined it would be. An assistant rescued the pieces. Another sculptor, Tiberio Calcagni, repaired what he could. The work that survives, the three figures of the hooded Nicodemus, the Virgin, and the Magdalene, supporting the shattered body of Christ, is half Michelangelo and half restoration. And yet the Nicodemus, hooded, bent over the body, bearing its weight, wears Michelangelo's face. He was present in the sculpture he tried to destroy. He was always present. The last Pietà, the Rondinini Pietà, which he was still working on 6 days before his death, is something that defies easy description. The two figures, Mary and the dead Christ, are barely differentiated from the marble around them. The bodies have been stripped of all the anatomical specificity that defined Michelangelo's work for 70 years. The surfaces are rough, unfinished, almost improvised. The two figures lean into each other in a way that suggests not just support, but fusion. Two forms becoming one, the boundary between them dissolving. It looks nothing like the Pietà in St. Peter's. The 24-year-old's obsession with technical perfection is entirely absent. What remains is something more essential and more terrifying. The simple, irreducible fact of one person holding another at the moment when holding is all that's left. He was 88 years old. He had been carving marble for 75 years. And at the end, he was still trying to find the right way to say what he had been trying to say from the beginning. On February 18th, 1564, Michelangelo died in his house in Rome. He had been declining for several days, and at the end was surrounded by his closest friends, including Tommaso de Cavalieri, who had remained close to him for 32 years, and who was present at the last. He left instructions that he wanted to be buried in Florence. The Pope wanted him buried in Rome, in St. Peter's, in the basilica he had spent his last 18 years building. His nephew and heirs smuggled the body out of Rome in a merchant's bale, labeled as goods, to prevent the Roman authorities from claiming it. It arrived in Florence 2 weeks after his death. The city received it the way cities receive their greatest sons, only after it is too late to tell them so. Giorgio Vasari, the painter and art historian whose Lives of the Artists remains the foundational text of Renaissance art history, organized the funeral. The ceremony at the Basilica of San Lorenzo was attended by virtually every artist in Florence. Michelangelo was buried in Santa Croce, where Dante, Galileo, and Machiavelli are also buried, under a tomb designed by Vasari. That represents the three arts Michelangelo had mastered: painting, sculpture, and architecture. He was 88 years old. He had outlived Leonardo da Vinci by 45 years. He had outlived Raphael by 44 years. He had outlived virtually everyone who had known him as a young man, and many who had known him as a middle-aged one. He had outlived 3 popes who had tried to direct his work, 2 Florentine governments that had tried to define his allegiances, and 1 professional rival who had tried to destroy his reputation by giving him an impossible job. He had not outlived his work. Nobody outlives work like that. What Michelangelo left behind is not simply a collection of masterpieces, however extraordinary those masterpieces are. It is a body of evidence for a proposition that the modern world finds simultaneously inspiring and uncomfortable, that the limits we accept are not the actual limits. Michelangelo was told, repeatedly and by people with authority, what he could not do. He could not be an artist. It was beneath his family. He could not paint the Sistine ceiling. He was a sculptor. He could not design St. Peter's. He was a painter and sculptor, not an architect. He could not, at 88, still be producing work of significance. He was too old, too ill, too broken. Every single one of these limitations was wrong. He was wrong about some things too. He was wrong about his enemies, whom he sometimes saw everywhere. He was wrong about money, which he hoarded with an anxiety that seems pathological given his income and his actual needs. He was wrong about his own limitations. The Rondinini Pietà, which he called unfinished and inadequate, is one of the most moving things any artist of any era ever produced. The self-portrait in the skin of Saint Bartholomew, the deflated, emptied man hanging from the saint's hand, in the Last Judgment, is the most honest thing Michelangelo ever said about himself. He felt, throughout his life, that the work always exceeded him, that whatever he managed to pull from the marble or apply to the ceiling was less than what the vision had demanded, that he was always, in some essential way, falling short. This is the thing that the myth of Michelangelo, the divine artist, the Il Divino, as his contemporaries called him, most consistently obscures, that the man who produced these things did not experience himself as a conduit of divine perfection. He experienced himself as a man in a permanent argument with his own inadequacy, fighting for every inch, doubting every surface, taking hammers to his own work in the night, because it wasn't what he meant, and going back the next day anyway. There is a letter Michelangelo wrote near the end of his life to his nephew Leonardo, who had been urging him to stop working and rest, to come back to Florence, to enjoy what he had accomplished. Michelangelo's answer was brief. He said that he would rest when there was nothing left that needed doing, and that as long as there was something left that needed doing, he could not rest. That this was not stubbornness. It was, he said, simply the way he was made. 6 days before he died, he was still working on the Rondinini Pietà. Simply the way he was made. I hope this story kept you company tonight. If you've made it to the end, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. The curious, the patient, the people who choose depth over noise, at whatever hour it happens to be. This is Art and Ashes, your companion for late nights and long questions. If this story gave you something, leave a like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which Michelangelo, the furious young sculptor, the reluctant painter, the lonely old man still carving at 88, feels most real to you. and tell us what story you want us to tell next. Every comment gets read. Thank you for listening. Until the next one.